Thanks for downloading this episode of Cork Talk with me, Tim Atkin. A weekly conversation with some of the most famous people in the world of wine.
This podcast is brought to you in partnership with Noma Cork by Vinventions. Driven by a commitment to innovation, the new plant-based Noma Cork Green Line offers significant improvements in wine closure performance. Thanks to a rigorous oxygen ingress rate, you can decide which cork is best for your wine, whether it's for young and fresh wines or for those with ageing potential.
Steve Webber earned his winemaking stripes at Leo Buring and Lindemans, but is best known for what he's achieved in the Yarra Valley at Bortoli over the last 34 years. A passionate Francophile, as well as a proud Australian, he's long championed elegance and finesse, especially in Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, making wines that he wants to drink above all. Wine, he says, should be a source of joy as well as a job. Hello, Steve. Welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, hi, Tim. How you going?
Absolutely fine. And you're in the Yarra Valley, aren't you, lucky man?
Yeah. It's it's the middle of winter, but it's it's fantastic. So
it's still one of the most beautiful places on earth. You must be so happy waking up looking at that every morning, aren't you?
Yeah, look, it is really beautiful. I think when we came here, I think we were just stunned that was sort of 34 years ago or thereabouts. I think we were just really stunned at the landscape and it just, it's always a bit different, and there's a lovely sort of depth of view, which I think is fantastic about the valley as well. So,
I mean, I've not been for a while, but I always love taking photographs there, especially if you can bother to get out of bed early in the morning. It's some great views, aren't there?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, great.
Listen, I want to talk to you a little bit about your background, because I read once that you once said you fell into wine, but that's not completely true, is it? I mean, it's probably you being a bit modest, I'd imagine, because your dad was an agronomist, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was, and he was very interested in wine and things like that. And he did some consultancy to some various sort of vineyard developments and that sort of stuff. So we were always sort of visiting vineyards and doing all that sort of stuff when we were kids. And but I suppose like any kid, you don't really know what you want to do, and so one suggestion my father said is, why don't you go and try work in a winery and see whether you might want to become a winemaker. And so I did a vintage, and like anybody doing their first vintage, pretty excited, and so I was sort of hooked, I suppose, and I managed to work at start at Leo Buring's, which was quite a famous Riesling producer at the time. And they gave me some fantastic opportunities.
I mean, that was in 1978, wasn't it?
It is, yeah.
Now, I don't want to remind you, but I mean, did you ever consider being anything else? I've had all sorts of people on this podcast, a lot of people who didn't make it as medics or dentists, even someone who wanted to be an astronaut. Did you have any kind of other dreams growing up?
I don't know what I wanted to do, really. I think I was just, I used to play a lot of tennis as a kid, and so I was quite good at tennis. So I guess some early stuff was that I'd love to have been a tennis player, but no, I was never good enough for that. So, yeah.
And what was your role at Leo Buring? Was it kind of typical cellar rat? You were just pulling hoses and...
Yeah, absolutely. And, I suppose, general cellar hand stuff, in those days we had, they had concrete tanks, and we were having to wax those tanks and, having to go down in this bloody small hole and spraying the wax on and then, burning it. It was hot, miserable bloody work. But I think, you've got to start, doing all that sort of stuff. I mean, the first job somebody learns around here is to clean a tank properly, So it's the same sort of thing, in those days. And look, the winery was actually quite a modern winery at the time, So we were doing sort of, they didn't have a lot of, chillers, chilling plates on tanks. So we had to do external chilling and that type of thing. But I suppose it's just sort of gaining confidence a little bit, because it does take a long time once you start in a winery to get some confidence in what you're doing, and you're not, shit scared all the time of turning a pump on or touching something. So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Leo Buring, you must have done well, because Leo Buring helped put you through Roseworthy Agricultural College, which is Australia's top wine school. I just wonder, what was the practical and academic focus in those days? Because it's changed a lot, hasn't it, since the early 80s?
Yeah, look, I think, when we went there, a great range of people. Some people had already done degrees. Some people were raw from high school. Others were already established, in business. Some were vets and doctors and that type of thing, going and doing a course. And everybody lived on site. So every day you were drinking, we had a wine tasting every day in somebody's room, trying different things. And so the weekends were spent, crawling through wine shops in Adelaide, trying to find something that nobody had ever tried before. And it's interesting. We used to, go into there, and I remember buying some Wanturna estate in the early days, from Victoria. And, later I had become a local here in the Yarra Valley, but people were very interested in Yarra Valley in those days, some of the early pioneers. So I think, while it may not have been as technical as it is now, I think you got a real feel for wine, and you were living with a whole group of, we had 25 in our class, and I'm still, pretty good friends with all 25 of them. When we see them, we do reminisce about some of the fantastic times. And we had a journalist in our course. He was actually doing the wine marketing course, Hugh and Hook, and you would know Hugh quite well.
Hugh very well, yeah.
And he was, he was fantastic. He used to bring his, 2 or 3 dozen bottles each term to his room, and we'd get through that, and everybody would probably do the same sort of thing. So I suppose what it lacked in academic excellence or whatever, we got a lot of really practical side of it. And yeah. I don't think there's anybody that came out of Roseworthy, that didn't have a real passion for wine, based on that. And I think I look at some of the kids going to Adelaide University now and things, and they've got their own group of friends doing other things. They don't seem to get together, I don't think, like we would have
quite the same way
in the early days. Yeah.
I mean, after you graduated, this sort of formative experience, you spent 7 years at Lindemans, Leo Buring, and you worked with quite a few legends there, didn't you? John Vickery, Phil Laffer, Carl Stockhausen. These are big names. I mean, did they mentor you in a way?
Yeah, look, I think It was quite interesting. I worked with, with those guys as well as quite a few others. I had a lot to do with Philip Laffer toward the end of my time there. He'd sort of come down in more of a management role to where I'd been working, but I think at Lindemans you always knew where you were in the pecking order. In terms of tasting, like you would taste last, there'd be, Philip Laffer, there'd be Albert Chan, there'd be Philip John, there'd be, a few of these other people well ahead in the pecking order, and you'd be sort of, down the sort of back listening. So I suppose, they were stricter times, I suppose. We take on a graduate and they say, step aside, Steve, I'm about to start tasting, sort of thing. So I think it's, I think Lindemans had real disciplines in place that have really taught me a lot about winemaking and winemaking disciplines and things like that. And I've got some other things to say about that, but we'll leave that for the minute.
In 1989, you left Lindemans to join de Bortoli. Yeah, had you met your wife, Leanne de Bortoli, obviously by then? I mean, how did you guys get together? Is she a winemaker too?
Well, she studied wine marketing at a different time at Roseworthy. She also went to Roseworthy, and we'd got married in 88, and 88. And so when she'd come to Coonawarra to live there, sort of with me, and while we're there, her mum and dad approached us and said, would we come and set up the Yarra operation for them? They'd bought the vineyard, they'd bought a winery over here about 18 months previous, and they were wanting to, develop the property, develop the winemaking side. I think in the early days they were quite interested in making sparkling wine, and 30 years on, we're now just starting to get really active in sparkling wine, but it's taken us sort of 30 years
to get there. Tell us a bit more about de Bortoli as a company, because it was founded by an Italian, wasn't it? And then he kind of went to Riverina. Just tell us about how many vineyards it owns today and how much wine does it make and how the company's evolved over the years. I mean, are you involved with all bits of it or just the Yarra bit?
I'm involved in mostly the Victorian side of the operation. So Just going back in history, it was Leanne's grandfather came out to Australia in 1924. By 1928, came with nothing. By 1928, he'd saved up enough money to buy a mixed farm in Griffith in New South Wales, growing grapes and peaches and apricots and all of that sort of stuff. And being a good Italian, he would grow asparagus on the channel banks, or he'd grow pumpkins to make extra money to be able to afford to do some stuff. And so he set the company up, and he had three children, 2 girls and a boy, and he was very, very successful with what they did. They would sell, they would make anything, any colour, any flavour, a lot of fortified wine and things like that. And he, they made a lot of money, and they set up, sort of distribution in Sydney, and it wasn't until sort of, Dean came along and, ran the winery, Leanne's father, and he basically took it from a small Italian winery to something quite large. And him and Leanne's older brother, his older son, they were very, very keen on developing vineyards in southern Victoria, and particularly the Yarra Valley. So in 1978, in 1987, they bought a property in the Yarra, and since then, since that sort of time, that sort of 35 years or so ago, they've expanded to three estates in the Yarra Valley for a total of about 250 hectares. The original plantings on the Yarra property were 12 hectares, so there's been a fair bit more development going there. And since then, we've planted vineyards in the King Valley, where we've got another 200 hectares. And we're very interested at the moment in Heathcote, where we and we're very interested in Heathcote for several different reasons and things. We just see a massive future of Shiraz, Shiraz Grenache type blends and things like that. And Grenache is something I'll talk about a bit later. But yeah, we're very keen on that region, and we have about 120 hectares now, and we're expanding that operation. And then recently we bought a property in Rutherglen, an established property called Rutherglen Estates, and where we've got quite large vineyard holdings, lots of fortifieds, lots of really interesting other vineyards, and we're quite excited about that.
And you're still family owned, aren't you?
Yeah, still family owned. So in Victoria, we cultivate, something like 800 hectares of vineyards, producing about 8,000 tons of fruit, I suppose. And then we've got another one, our major winery in New South Wales has a crush of generally about 50 or 60,000 tons a year. So it's, quite a big operation. It employs quite a lot of people, 400 odd full-time people. So yeah, it's a large, family wine business. We do some other farming and things like that as well, where we grow rice and cotton and some of those sort of things to diversify a little bit. So it's great.
Plenty to keep you occupied then. But tell us a bit more about the Yarra Valley, because for people who don't know it, I mean, we've mentioned how beautiful it is. Just tell us, where it is and what are the major influences on the climate, maybe the sub-regions that there are within the valley.
Yeah, look, I guess the Yarra is one of 5 main regions around Melbourne. So we're about 50 kilometres to the northeast of Melbourne City. So there's and then to the south of Melbourne is the Mornington Peninsula, about the same distance. And to the west is the Bellarine Peninsula, which is about the same distance. And to the north, you've got sort of Macedon. And they're the sort of main regions around Melbourne. And all are quite cool climates, all, concentrating on Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. But the Yarra is basically divided into two areas, I suppose, and that is, it's the lower sort of reaches of the Yarra Valley in around the townships of Healesville and Yarra Glen, and there's the upper parts of the Yarra that aren't particularly higher in altitude, but they're certainly cooler and much higher rainfall. So we roughly call it the upper and lower reaches of the Yarra Valley, two quite different climates. Soil types up there can vary, but they're predominantly volcanic, which is quite usual for a lot of the regions that around northern Tasmania, same sort of soil types, this sort of basalt. I think it was the same volcano in Bass Strait. But, parts of the Mornington Peninsula where, Red Hill, Main Ridge, same sort of soil types, these deep red sort of basalt soils. So we've got that part of the Yarra, which is, high rainfall, probably in your terms, about 50 inches of rainfall a year. Yeah, maybe 60 in some places. And you've got Dixon's Creek where we are, which is about 27 inches of rainfall, 28 inches of rainfall, something like that. So quite a lot drier. All sedimentary soils down here in this part of the valley, the odd sort of outcrop of granite or, here and there, but, it's predominantly, siltstone, sandstone and limestone.
Interesting. Just tell us a bit about the way you farm, because I know that sustainability is a big focus for you guys across the company. How does that affect what you do, particularly in the vineyard?
Yeah, look, I think sustainability is really important. We don't have an organic certification. We're quite similar to the French in it's sort of a bit more la lutte raisonnée type viticulture. We do a lot of work with our soils in terms of trying to increase the biology in the soils. We're making 1,000 tonnes of compost a year, all sort of green manure compost, and we're spreading around that. We do a lot of compost tea work and things like that to try and improve the biology and get more, try and store water in the soil rather than, letting it run off and things like that. So, there's a lot of that type of thing. We're incredibly sensitive to anything nasty. We still use the occasional herbicide, but we're generally, it's big scale viticulture here, but we're really trying to do it on a really sympathetic way, I suppose, as best we can. With all of our waste, water streams and things like that, whether it's grape marc or whether it's sort of wastewater from the winery, that's all recycled, all reused back on the vineyard. So, it's a fairly closed system here. And I suppose like everybody, we have an attitude here of we want to leave this piece of land that we cultivate in a better condition than how we found it. Mm. And we've got kids that are coming into the business now, and we'd really like to leave them something really special, and I think we when you talk about that, some of the vineyard sort of work that we're doing at the moment in terms of replanting and things like that, our generation won't see the result of all of that clonal work and things that we're doing with Pinot and Cabernet and Chardonnay for in my working life. But it'll be nice to think that the next generation will benefit from hopefully some fairly wise decisions.
And tell us a bit about your winemaking. It's interesting. I think you said in the early days you were show focused for the first 10 years. That's the Australian show system, which basically rewards wines with gold, silvers and bronzes, etc. And then your approach changed radically, didn't it, in 1998. And I love a quote of yours. You're saying it's harder to do nothing. Was that the thing that changed? What was it that changed you after 10 years there?
Yeah, look, there are a few things that changed us. At that point in time, I think that, Leanne had gone through a cancer scare and she's fine now. But she was, we did a lot of soul searching in terms of what we really wanted to get out of life and to do. And I think often in Australia, and, particularly in the early days, the wine show system was such an important system for promoting wine, and I think people were tending to make wines for the wine show system, not make wines that they really enjoyed or reflected, the place in which they're grown or, all of the, aspects of terroir. So I guess it's, it was just a change of heart. We decided that we wanted to, make a bit of wine in France, and we went to Gevrey, bags packed, bought some fruit, made some wine. Probably didn't learn anything about winemaking, but we just felt that we understood finally that it was so important to understand the land that you cultivate, and that wines need to reflect that. And I suppose everything that we've done since then have been to try and make wine that reflects the site and the season. And irrespective of what a wine judge thinks of the wines that we make or our interpretation, I'm not that concerned. And interestingly enough, when you do adopt that kind of thing, people genuinely like they genuinely like the wines that you make. So I suppose,
I was going to say, I think the wine show system has changed. I mean, you were chairman of the Melbourne show, and I was lucky enough to judge it with you as the international judge 2008 to 2010. And I remember you telling us on the first day, I don't want you to give a gold medal to anything you wouldn't buy a case of. So I think enjoyment, you put sort of enjoyment front of it, front of judgment, really, rather than just saying to people, look for the faults, kicked out all the faults. We want super clean wines. So there's been this shift in the show system, hasn't there?
Yeah, look, I think it's been great, the changes, and I think it wasn't we were still giving trophies to incredibly oaky wines in prior to this sort of happening. And I think one of the changes we tried to make at Melbourne was to look for wines with charm and interest, and maybe not look firstly for wine faults, but to look for some of the really nice things in wine. And I think the collection of people that we assembled for that wine show were fantastic, and everybody really embraced it. And I think we had lots of debates with other wine shows and things like that about perhaps some of the classes and things like that. But I really think it changed a lot of the way people looked at wine shows and how other things. And I think now, Brisbane wine shows, a very considered wine show. If I put something in there, I know the sort of people it's got to get past to do well. People that drink very nice wine and are quite considered and things like that. Yeah. The other sort of bit that I could never work out in the early days was we'd sit around as wine judges at night, and we'd drink all this lovely Burgundy, white and red, the occasional, sort of bottle of Bordeaux or whatever, and we'd go to the show the next day and we'd forget everything we drank the previous night that we were all waxing lyrical about, and we would give it to the sort of Australian versions of this sort of thing. So I suppose there was also maybe a little bit of a change to a more European, to a more European style or English style of judging, I suppose. Just looking for charm and finesse, for character and subtlety and finesse. Yes.
I mean, I love your advice to aspiring winemakers, which is to drink lots of interesting wine and make wine you want to drink. I mean, I know you drink a lot of good wine. I mean, not just Australian wine, but you love kind of having a global perspective on wine, don't you? What else do you like drinking?
Oh, look, wine's become, it's become so expensive. You and I used to probably drink, more than our fair share of Rousseau, Raveneau, Rouleau, Chave, etc. In the early days, and now I suppose I guess with the cost of those wines, we tend to drink easier sort of styles of wine and much more accessible and things like that. So I drink a lot of local Chardonnay, Pinot. We're very interested, Leanne and I are very interested in Gamay. We're quite interested in Pinot Gris. It gets a bit of a bad run, Pinot Gris, but I think grown in some cool areas, I think it can make some fairly exciting wine. And internationally, we drink a fair bit of Beaujolais, and a little bit of Chablis and the occasional bottle of Burgundy, but
when we can afford it,
when we can afford it. The other sort of area, I suppose, that I've been looking at, we've been drinking a bit more of the more aromatic styles of Syrah and Grenache. Some of those sort of, lighter, more fragrant, wines, large wood, etc. And I think every winemaker in Australia is incredibly interested in Grenache, sort of particularly in our warm climates. So, yeah.
Tell us a bit more about Chardonnay. Partly because I love your Chardonnays, but it's arguably the grape that's improved most in Australia over the last decade or so. What was it that changed, do you think, and where will further improvements come from?
Well, Chardonnay, I feel probably changed in around 2002 to 2005. I think they were the big years of change, and I think we'd all been waiting for things to ripen. What we perceived as Beaumay ripeness was always at a 12.5, and we'd lose all of our acidity. And particularly in places like the Yarra, we'd lose acidity from 12 potential alcohol to 12.5. So we thought we would start picking a little bit earlier, and we would make some finer sort of styles of wine. We were a little bit different to some others. We did like to put our wines through malolactic fermentation too, so that we could at least balance if we didn't have high alcohols. If we were only around that 11.8 or 12 alcohol, we would at least have softness in our acidity. So I think we did that. Sometimes I feel we went too far and too lean and that sort of stuff. And I think that's a criticism, generally that most people would have of those early changes. But I think it is the pendulum story. If you never know what it's like, if you're hovering at around 11 o'clock on the dial, and you take it to 2 o'clock, for example, and 2's just a bit too far, then at least you can come back to 1:30 or to 1 o'clock. And I think, we always said that, you were pretty piss weak if you didn't know where it was that, went too far. You've almost got to go past the point of the pendulum. So, so I suppose it's just, if you want to be on the edge, you've got to be fairly game. Well,
it's interesting because you've always liked to push boundaries, and I just wonder, have you ever gone too far? Any stuff-ups you'd like to tell us about, and successes that have come out of you pushing something too far and thinking, actually, it's not too far?
Yeah, I think that Chardonnay one was a bit too far. I wrote something else down that, probably whole bunches in Syrah. I think, there were times when I got fairly excited about whole bunches in Syrah because I just thought it gave this fabulous graphite-y sort of character. But I think in some of the years when we didn't quite have the ripeness, the greenness came through too much. And I think we've since learned, we've learned a fair bit about Syrah now, where, we know what to do in the, if we're going to include whole bunches in Syrah, then we do it in the riper, warmer years, and and the wines are stunning. And in those cooler years, we now tend to realise that you do whole berries and leave the stems out of it. So I suppose that's one area that you learn as you go. It doesn't happen overnight, and this is this thing of learning about the land that you cultivate and that sort of stuff, and starting to understand that.
Tell us a bit more about Pinot Noir, because you've described Pinot as your obsession, I think. I don't know if you remember Craig Smith used to run the Australian Wine Centre in the Strand in London, and he was the self-appointed secretary of the Australian Pinot Noir Why Do We Bother Society. Things have changed a bit since then. With Pinot now is really good, isn't it? Is that site? Is it clones? Is it a combination of the two? Is it winemaking? What is it?
I think with Pinot, we always said to ourselves in the early days, and we used to talk about this as a group of Pinot producers and things like that, when we stopped trying to make red Burgundy, we'll probably make the best Pinots we've ever made. And I think the direction of Australian Pinots really changed in the last 5 to 6 years. I think people are really looking for fragrance and aromatics, not so much deepness of colour and that sort of thing. I think that's, pretty good. And I think, there's some real drinkability happening at the moment in Australian Pinot. I've probably never felt it's more different to Burgundy at the moment. And I think that's awesome. I think it's, fantastic that we're not trying to emulate that. And I think some of the wines, in not trying to be like Burgundy, I think they're going to sort of develop into something really exciting and similarly exciting. We've always had an attitude that, that if you can't afford to drink it, you might as well make it, like if you can't afford to buy something that really, does this to us, then I think it is important that you really try and make some of it. And I think, what I'm seeing at the moment at really the top end of Pinot Noir, like I'm talking about areas like the Upper Yarra and some of the best vineyards there. I'm talking about sort of Main Ridge and Red Hill on the Mornington Peninsula, those upper vineyards. Just about all over Tasmania, there's some really exciting, Pinot sites and things like that. But I think, one of the things we were talking about the other day, apart from that fruit, is just this idea of not being afraid to pull it out of oak a little earlier if you feel it's going to sort of dry out, and maintaining sort of fruit freshness and things like that. And I've tried some Pinots in the last few years that have been pulled out in, like that have had barely 6 months of age in their maturation in barrels, and they're ready. They're delicious. They're complete, and it's not like they're falling over, quickly either. They have a brightness about them, and and I'm really excited about that.
Tell us about so-called alternative grapes and which ones have the most potential, maybe especially in the Yarra Valley, and just wonder about how those fit in with how climate change is affecting the Australian wine industry.
Yeah, I think we're pretty gung ho about Gamay. We're growing a fair bit. We've got a fair bit of clonal material. We're pulling some Pinot Noir vineyards out which we think are too warm, and we're replanting with either Syrah, Cabernet or Gamay. And I suppose with Gamay we're just finding that the wines are so bright, so easy to drink. They have got this sort of, and it's a word overdone, but a little crunchiness and things like that to them. And I just think they're just a really lovely, sort of bistro style red. We think that there's, sort of tremendous opportunities. We've grown more than we need, and we're starting to sell to a few of the smaller producers to try and get Gamay out there for a lot of the people that don't understand it. So that's sort of, going to be pretty important. But I think it is a variety that's very well suited to the Yarra. And look, there's lots being planted in Tasmania as well. People are pretty excited about it. As for some of the warmer sites in the Yarra, I would say that, and we don't have any planted, but I'd say Grenache will, it will become quite popular here. We've already made a commitment to Grenache in Heathcote, so it's a bit difficult for me to turn around and say I've changed my mind on where we should grow Grenache. But I think it's I think Grenache is it's a variety that is beautifully fragrant. It doesn't need to be big and things like that. One of the and I think I think the warmer climates I think they're starting to appreciate, how good Grenache and Carignan and some of these other varieties are going to be, the Iberian grape varieties in some of those warmer climates.
Italian? maybe?
And yeah, some Italian things. I mean, I'd love to have some Nerello Mescalese, available to plant, or some Caricante, So I suppose it's just, I think there's real opportunities with climate change to fix the problems we have in, with sort of traditional varieties that are maybe not as suitable anymore. I couldn't even imagine drinking a straight McLaren Vale Shiraz anymore without having some Grenache in it, because the Grenache is so gorgeous. Why wouldn't you put it in there? Even a 10 or 15% addition to give a little bit of charm and perfume to the wines.
Yeah. Tell us about the next generation, because your kids, Kate and Sally, both lovely kids. Are they working in the business now, the fourth generation of the De Bortoli Webbers?
Yeah, well, Kate's working in the business as a winemaker in the Yarra. She studied science at a local university here, Monash, and she's been doing vintages around the world. We think we really think that the winemaking experience, or I feel the winemaking experience that she's going to get is going to really give her some, is going to give her some real knowledge and some sort of credibility, I suppose, to do some other stuff for us if she wanted to move out of winemaking and get into some other sort of stuff. I think in a lot of sort of family companies, finding people that have got a passion for wine and a genuine understanding, and sort of particularly with product development and that type of thing, understanding what wine is about, and I think that's what we find when we're talking to marketing people is we can we're traveling the world, we're drinking a whole lot of wine from a whole different range of regions and things like that, and I think often it's it's something that's sort of missing in some companies, and I think families need that that knowledge, I suppose, of what the world of wine is.
Well, we know you like travelling, and I know you make a mean pizza because I've had some of them. I mean, do you ever feel the need to get away from wine? Or is it just so much a part of your life that you don't need to?
Look, I think wine's such an amazing sort of thing because you do it for a job and you do it for joy. We've just had a couple of weeks in Corsica with some friends. 16 of us went away, including our kids and their partners and some friends. And whilst we didn't visit any wineries or anything like that, everybody loves wine. So you're constantly everybody's interested in trying the local produce and things like that. We drank a body weight in sort of rosé daily, while we're in Corsica. But I think it is difficult to get away from it because it's like food. It's it's very much part of your life, and and I think so. While we don't get too carried away with wine, when we're socially or when we're traveling, it's sort of quite, it's still very much part of your lives. We love drinking good wine and we love eating fantastic food. So yeah, it's true.
I must say I love drinking great wine and enjoying fantastic food with you because some of the best meals I've had in my life have been with you in your company, opening great bottles of wine. It's been too long. I hope to see you very soon. Thanks for being on the podcast. See you either in Australia or back over here in Europe. Thanks, mate.
Yeah, no problem, Tim. Thanks.
What a thoughtful and talented winemaker Steve is. The Yarra Valley is lucky to have him. Next week on Cork Talk, my guest is the journalist John Bonnet, author of The New French Wine. Join me then. Thanks for listening to Cork Talk. If you want to read more reports, articles and tasting notes by me, go to my website, timatkin.com. You can also follow me on Twitter @timatkin and on Instagram @timatkinmw. See you next week.